Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa man tabi'ahum bi isanin ila yawmiddin wa ba'd. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Jazakallah khair. As we jump back into the life and legacy of the great Imam Ibn al-Wasiti rahimahullah ta'ala, picking up where we left off of sorts, tonight's discussion will continue to explore how faith is expressed through boundaries. The limits within our law that protect our heart. I'll take one, thank you. Protect our heart, our sight, even our touch. Imam al-Wasiti, he taught that the way a person guards these limits reflects what they truly believe about Allah's nearness and watchfulness, His vigilance, the servant's vigilance, that is. So the outer law, we should understand the legal code of Islam, the Sharia, is not a shell around spirituality, but it is the vessel which carries it. And so every time someone adheres to that law, whether it is by fulfilling an obligation or restraining from a prohibition, including things like what they look at, what they touch, the company that they keep, then this is, in and of itself, a form of remembrance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala sees everything, hears everything, is aware and knowing of all things. And so the servant keeps that in mind. Allah is aware of what I'm doing, what I am thinking, my most subtle inclinations. We've talked a great deal about singing and music in the past through Imam al-Wasiti's critique of the Sama'a sessions that he witnessed in his early days in al-Wasit. Tonight we're going to circle back to that with a passage from Imam al-Ghazali. And you might be thinking, we've been talking about this music thing for quite some time, even publishing the translation of al-Wasiti's treatise on the topic. But the coverage that we've offered so far on the topic cannot compare to the reality of this problem. We would have to talk for days and years without cessation. The conversation would have to continue on and on and on for multiple years to even begin to catch up with how deeply rooted music is within our cultures. Not just Western culture, but across the Muslim world. Not just music, but also every element involved in it, which essentially exacerbates the sin, escalating it in its nature. The way that the singer appears, the gender of the singer, the voice that's being used, the clothing that's worn, the vibrations of the body, the atmosphere, the audience, the whole thing, we would have to talk for decades. And so while, yes, it might seem in our current context of these weekly meetings that we've talked about this subject quite a bit, it does not do justice to the nature of the topic and how it has pervaded every single, it has become, or I should say invaded, every single aspect of our lives. You cannot watch even a nature documentary without music being played in the background. The most innocent of things to look at, Allah's creation. It's there. So let's check this out from Imam al-Ghazali. As we've come to understand, he was one of those who permitted certain forms of singing, sama'a, spiritual singing, if you will. But it was not unrestricted. He had a multitude of strict safeguards that would impact the ruling from being one of permissible to a much lesser degree. And he warned specifically about, this is what we're going to look at tonight, the voice of a woman or a young man, we should say a boy, that arouses fitna or desires and temptations. And when this is the case, the listening of what he permits becomes forbidden. In his framework, it's not because of the melody that's being sung, but it's the person that's doing it. By them doing it, it awakens desire within the listener. And so he reminds us that there is a very thin line between beauty, as he describes it, and temptation. A very thin line. And it's not necessarily about the sound that's heard, but it's about the very soul that receives it. So let's take a look at this passage, because following this we're going to look at some of the divine limits that govern the Awrah, which is the private areas that cannot be seen. We're going to talk a little bit about private company, Khalwah. We're going to talk about touching the opposite gender as well as illicit relations. And the rulings that pertain to these particular things are not like minor social etiquettes or protocols, but they're major acts that could lead to a person's spiritual collapse and their downfall in this life and in the next. And of course, we're going to look at that through the lens of the great Imams of the Hanabila, particularly Ibn Qudāmah in his book al-Kāfī. And then we'll weigh that against some of the relied upon works of the latter generation in order to better understand, as we've been doing, what perhaps framed or helped support the framework of Imam al-Wasiti in his spiritual principles. So here's Imam al-Ghazālī in Ihya Ulūm-ud-Dīn. This is the section on the first hindrance of Sama'ah, basically the first rule, if you will. And he says that it arises when the performer whose voice is heard is of a woman whom it is unlawful to look upon, and there is fear of fitna in listening to her. The same ruling applies to beardless youth, meaning boys, obviously, whose beauty arouses desire. In such cases, listening is prohibited. So we can see right there the ruling changed because it entails fitna. The fear of fitna, not because of the singing itself, but because of what it provokes. Even if the woman were simply conversing without melody, yet her voice might stir desire, it would not be permissible to converse with her, exchange greetings, or listen to her reciting the Quran. And the same applies to a youth whose presence invites temptation. So we're looking at this from the perspective of a male listener. A male listening to a woman with a sweet, melodious voice, arousing temptation, and also a young boy. We've talked about how off-putting that might be for most of us. It does cause temptation for some. So he says, you might ask, is it therefore unlawful in every case as a means of closing the door altogether, or only when there is actual fear of temptation for one who struggles with desire? He says, I would reply, this issue admits two legal foundations that pull in opposite directions. The first principle is that seclusion with a non-mahram woman and looking at her face are prohibited whether or not fitna is feared, since they generally lead to it. Hence, the law has closed that door completely without considering individual circumstances. Those two things. Seclusion, khalwa, with a non-mahram woman and looking at her face. If you remember, this is one of Imam al-Wasiti's gripes with the sessions that he witnessed when he was younger. They were sitting together, men and women, the women uncovering their faces. Sometimes much more than that. And he's saying, just in this case, the law, the Sharia, closes the door completely and is not worried whether you can handle yourself or not. We're just shutting the door. The second principle is that looking at boys is permitted except when fitna is feared. All right, so two different rulings, one for a woman and one for a young boy. So you're permitted to look at young boys, meaning a man, unless you fear there's fitna. So they're not included with women in a general ruling of prohibition, but judged according to circumstance. Now the ruling becomes customized to the individual. Generally you can look, but if you're a person that's tempted by that, then you're not allowed. So he says the voice of a woman lies between these two principles. If we compare it to looking at her, then the door should likewise be closed. And this analogy is close. Yet there remains a difference. Desire is awakened more swiftly by sight at its first stirring than by hearing the voice. And the movement of lust through looking and touching is stronger than through listening. Lust is incited through looking and touching more than it is through listening. In addition to that, a woman's voice apart from singing is not Awrah. It's not something that must be concealed. In the time of the companions, radiyallahu anhum, women used to speak with men in greeting, inquiry, consultation, and other matters. However, singing exerts an additional power in stirring desire. It is therefore more fitting to compare this to looking at handsome youths, since they have not been commanded to veil themselves, just as women have not been commanded to veil their voices. The ruling should therefore follow the presence or absence of temptation and the context that provokes it, restricting prohibition to that. He says, in my view, Imam al-Ghazālī is the sounder and more balanced analogy, what he just explained. It is reinforced by the hadith of the two young girls who sang in the house of Aisha, for it is known that the Prophet ﷺ heard their voices and did not avoid it. But fitna was not feared in his case, alayhi salatu wassalam. Hence, he did not take precaution against it. If you're familiar with that hadith, then you would know Abu Bakr as-Siddiq came in while this was playing out in the house of the Prophet, and he said, is this the flute of shaitan in the Prophet's house? When they were singing? Meaning, basically, rebuking his daughter Aisha radiallahu anha. How is this happening? This sound of the shaitan in the Prophet's house? And the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam told Abu Bakr to ease up and let it happen. He didn't fear any fitna. And so the ruling varies according to Imam al-Ghazālī with the condition of the woman and the condition of the man, whether he's young or old, for circumstances alter the likelihood of temptation, the condition of the woman and the condition of the man. So he says, for example, that an elderly man may kiss his wife while fasting, whereas a young man should not. For the kiss of youth leads toward intercourse, which is forbidden during fasting. In like manner, listening may lead to looking and physical approach, both of which are unlawful. Therefore, this too differs according to persons and situations. So, the main points of Imam al-Ghazālī here, the main idea for him is that the issue isn't with the song itself. And we highlighted this previously. He said singing is permissible. We've already discussed the various rulings, especially according to the Hanbali school. And Imam al-Ghazālī even mentions in his Ihya the various rulings of the madhahib. So it's not about the song for him, it's about the temptation that it can awaken within the listener. He also mentions that the woman's voice is not Awrah by itself, because women spoke to men in the Prophet's time. The problem is when that voice stirs desire, and singing adds risk to that, because the melody or an emotional voice will move the heart in ways that a normal voice could not. And so the danger of temptation is much greater. He also highlights two approaches in the Sharia. First is to close the door completely, like banning seclusion or looking at a woman even without desire. Or how you judge by a situation, like looking at boys for men, allowing it unless there's temptation. And so he says that a woman's voice sits between these two rulings, usually allowed but prohibited when fitna is likely. And so in this case, he would say, it's not permissible for the woman to sing in front of men due to what arises of fitna. And he gives the example of, this hadith of Aisha radiallahu anha and the girls that were singing in her house. The Prophet ﷺ not forbidding it because there was no temptation present. So the circumstances matter according to Imam al-Ghazālī. He highlights that to the issue of fasting. So what might be safe for an older man may not be safe for a younger man, etc. The goal for him is to prevent small actions like listening to someone singing from leading to greater sin. The greater sin being from going from listening, escalating it from listening, to now touching, and then to illicit relations. The practical takeaway here from him is that if the voice stirs desire, you're not allowed to listen. If there's no desire and no risk, normal speech is permitted. Normal speech between a man and a woman. Essentially, the spiritual lesson is that the limits that he's highlighted, according to his understanding, and all of the other limits that are set based on different schools of thought are after the same aim. And that is to protect the heart of the servant. To protect them from spiritual ruin, moral collapse, falling into some of the worst of major sins. And by guarding yourself, guarding the senses, not only what you see, but also what you listen to, what you touch, you can keep your faith intact. And you can maintain purity of heart. So that's Imam al-Ghazali in that particular point that he makes about the woman's voice or that of the young boy. When it comes to singing, and when we look at now, we're going to move into al-Kāfī by Ibn Qudāmah and look at some of the legal framework about the Awrah, etc. We'll see some overlap with Imam al-Ghazali, even though there's that major point of contention, which is singing permissible in the first place? Now, we already talked about how that can impact the person within the Hanbali framework, all the way down to their very muru'ah, their honor being disgraced, their ability to even serve as a witness. So let's look at this. There's a few places in the books of the Hanabila where you can find the topic of al-Awrah being addressed. Two main areas are in shurut al-Salah, because we have to talk about covering the Awrah for prayer, and then in nikah, kitab al-nikah, when it comes to what's permissible for you to look at when you're interested in potentially engaging with a woman for marriage. You can also find it in kitab al-janaiz, which is about funerals when it comes to washing the deceased. And we're going to look at that because it's very relevant. And then you can find it in other places mentioned in a more of like an indirect way, or mentioned in passing, like for example, Hajj and Umrah, wearing the ihram. Men have to wear a certain type of clothing versus women. Have you ever thought about that? Why is it that women can wear normal fitted clothing and men have to wear the rida and izar? So at the very core of that difference is this issue about the Awrah. A woman wearing the izar and the rida. You can only imagine, if you've ever worn it as a man, you know that it has to be managed, and it's not always going to be managed properly, especially the upper part. And so that's one of the reasons, legal reasons, that they say the woman is permitted to wear regular fitted clothing while she's in ihram, in the state of ihram, unlike the man. So let's check this out with the third condition of prayer covering the Awrah. Imam Ibn Qudāmah, he says, this is of course the third condition of prayer, as is reported from Aisha, the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Allah does not accept the prayer of a menstruating woman except in a khimar, the head covering. You find this in Sunan Abi Dawud. And he said, the Awrah of a man is what lies between the navel and the knees. What is below the navel and above the knees is part of the Awrah, also reported by the Prophet ﷺ. It was also, he was reported to have said, this is in Musnad Imam Ahmad, cover your thigh, for the thigh is a part of the Awrah. So the navel and the knees themselves are not Awrah. Right? What is between the navel and the knee? This is of the man, of course. We're talking about general. All we're going to address is free men and women. We're not going to start talking about bond servants, etc., because they have different levels of Awrah. But free men and women, which is the majority of society today, this is the Awrah for a man. That is between the navel and the knee. The navel and the knee being excluded. What lies between is the Awrah. As for the woman, her entire body is Awrah, except the face. We're talking about in prayer. Regarding the hands, he says there are two narrations. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what means this is Surah Nur, and Nur, that's 24, verse number 31. And let them not display their adornment except what ordinarily appears thereof. So Ibn Abbas interpreted this to mean her face and her hands. He also notes that it's forbidden for a woman in the state of ihram to cover her face with a veil or her hands with gloves. If these were Awrah, covering them would not have been forbidden. That's Ibn Qudāmah's viewpoint there. The second narration holds that the hands are Awrah in prayer, because there is no hardship in covering them, so they resemble the rest of the body. Everything beyond this is Awrah in light of the Prophet's statement, Allah does not accept the prayer of a menstruating woman except with a khimar. The khimar is a gown that covers a large portion of her body, including her head and neck. Another hadith, Salama, she said, she asked the Messenger of Allah, may a woman pray in a dur, which is a long shirt, and khimar, without an izar? A long shirt like a gown, and the khimar that goes over the head, neck, chest area, sometimes down to the arms, etc., without the izar, which would be the lower wrap that would go under this longer shirt. And he said, yes, if the shirt is ample and covers the tops of her feet, meaning that it goes all the way to the floor, then she could pray in that one gown without the need of a bottom garment. So that's what the Awrah is defined as in prayer, according to Ibn Qudāmah. So when we jump over to the chapter on marriage, because we'll find that there's a discrepancy here between the Awrah of prayer and the Awrah outside of prayer. In the chapter on marriage, he says, whoever intends to marry a woman is permitted to look at her. Jabir reported that the Prophet ﷺ said, if one of you proposes to a woman, then if he's able to look at what will incline him to marry her, let him do so. Indicating that you should be attracted to her before you commit to her. You don't want to get in a relationship and then all of a sudden you see her for the first time and you're repelled. Allah has created us in that way. We're all attracted to different things, and the physical attraction strengthens the bond between the partners. Is that everything? No. We are wise enough, based on the Prophet's guidance, to understand that. However, it is one of the things that he said people marry for. And just because the deen, your religion, is the most important aspect, it doesn't mean you don't consider what is lesser. In fact, the scholars of the madhab, they say that you shouldn't address the deen until you've addressed the physical attraction. You need to address the physical attraction piece first before you address the religious piece, so that you're not rejecting her based on beauty while she has a good religion. So step one is there attraction? Yes. Then you can see what the deen is. And that way, if you reject, it will be based on the deen and not based on beauty. So if you saw, oh, she's got a great religion, and then you look and say, oh, I'm not interested because the attraction's not there, then you're rejecting somebody that has a good religion based on a lesser quality. All right, so they prioritize that in such a way so that the religious qualities are given ultimate preference in the decision-making factors. So he says, when he's saying here, Ibn Qudāmah carries on and he says, he may look at the face, for it gathers the features of beauty. And this is the usual object of consideration, the face. And it's not Awrah. This is Ibn Qudāmah. Outside of prayer, he's saying, you can look at the face, number one, because that's typically the most beautiful part that people consider, and because it's not Awrah. As for what ordinarily appears, such as the hands and feet, there are two reports. The first is that it's permissible because these parts commonly appear, so they are akin to the face. And the second is it's not permissible because they are Awrah and thus like what does not ordinarily appear. It is not permissible to look at what does not ordinarily appear, for it is Awrah, and there is also no need to look at it. He may look with her permission or without it, for the Prophet ﷺ gave an unrestricted permission to look, and it is not lawful to restrict what he left unrestricted. In Jabir's report, he said, I proposed to a woman, and I would conceal myself to observe her until I saw of her that which inclined me to marry her, meaning I found her to be attractive, and so I married her. He is not allowed to be in seclusion, Khalwah, with her. For the texts speak only of looking, and seclusion therefore remains upon its original prohibition. This is where Ibn Qudāmah addresses the ruling of Khalwah in a most explicit manner. You can look if you're interested in marriage, and you can look at the face, because what appears to be his conclusion is that, and this is an argument within the madhab, it's very well known, it's quite a lengthy debate within the madhab as to whether or not the face is included in the Awrah or not of the woman. So it appears that his view is it's not a part of the Awrah in the prayer or outside of the prayer, and so you can look at that part of her body, but you cannot do it while secluded, meaning you can't be sitting with her alone. It's not because you're looking at her face, it's because you're alone. The Khalwah here, he says, remains upon its original prohibition, haram. He says, a man is permitted to look at the face of a woman with whom he is engaged in transactions, out of the need to identify her for asserting the rights of a contract. Likewise, it is permitted in testimony, due to the need to identify her for bearing and delivering testimony. A physician may look at whatever the treatment requires of her body. In the event that she needed to be treated by a male, a female was unavailable to treat her, then the physician will be permitted to look at her body, even her private parts, for this is a case of necessity akin to the need for circumcision. Right, so we're seeing how the ruling becomes different based on the level of need. He also, this is an added benefit, he says a man may look among his Mahram women at what commonly appears, such as the head, the neck, the hands, and feet. And this is based on the saying of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what it means, and they should not display their adornment except to their husbands. So here, basically he's saying that, and there's no blame upon them concerning their fathers. So a mahram is one who is permanently unlawful to marry due to lineage or to lawful causes, such as a wife's mother or a wife's daughter. So if you got married to a woman, you can't marry the wife's mother. You can't marry her mother, nor could you marry the daughter. As for the mother of a woman with whom fornication occurred, or of one who was entered upon by shubha, a mistaken intercourse, and likewise her daughter, it is not permitted to look at them as mahrams because their prohibition arises from an unlawful cause, and so they do not take the ruling of blood relations. So that addresses the issue of when, like for example, I'm going to use a term that, like a modern term, is like a baby daddy. Somebody's baby daddy doesn't mean that they're mahram. That means they had the baby without being married. So that man doesn't all of a sudden become a mahram because he's taken part in, birthing a child or been a part of the procedure in the process. The baby daddy doesn't become the mahram here because it was an unlawful occurrence. The point here, I think, the added benefit that we can take a look at for our practical purposes is the nature of looking at mahram women in your own family, in your own household. And you're permitted to look at them at what commonly appears, as he says, the head, the neck, the hands, and the feet. And we'll see that the later view of the Hanabila, they extend that a little further. However, it should be understood well and clear that just because the woman is a mahram doesn't mean you get to look at all of her body. Right? You don't get to look at a mahram woman without clothing, like she's undressed fully. And you don't get to look at her when she has clothing that reveals large parts of her body. Right? So like a woman walking around with short shorts and a little tank top. Right? Your family, one of your women in your family or something. Walking around in the house like that with little low shorts, or high shorts, I don't know, high shorts, right? And a little tank top. I don't want you to try and visualize all this stuff, but it's like somebody's grown daughter walking around in the house like that in front of their dad. Like, that's your daughter. I mean, so obviously the ruling on what type of engagement you can have with her is clear, it should be, but it doesn't mean that doesn't ever happen. And then there's also what you should be seeing of your daughter as a father, or, I don't know, your sister, or your mom even. All right, so these things have to be considered. That basically what I'm getting at is even in the home, the women with the men that they can't marry, they still have to be dressed in a modest manner. They can't be just like walking around in like bathing suit type stuff. He also goes on and it says, like, for example, an elderly woman who's not desired like the younger peers may be looked at with respect to what commonly appears based on what means his statement, Allah Azza wa Jal, what means, as for elderly women who no longer hope for marriage, there is no blame upon them if they lay aside their outer garments, provided they do not display their adornment. So an elderly woman who's no longer sought after because she's beyond the age, then she could essentially remove, and we're not talking about her clothing, but we're talking about her outer garments. She's still covered modestly, and the ruling would change for her. And this is also, according to Ibn Qudāmah, applies to women that are disfigured. She might not be elderly, but she might be disfigured in a way that there's no desire there. It doesn't mean that she's allowed to uncover herself. It just means the layer of clothing and the manner that she's presented it changes from one who is desired after. The level of modesty in Islam also, according to Ibn Qudāmah, penetrates into the relationship of husband and wife. He says that each spouse is permitted to look at and touch all of the other's body. Permitted to. So now we're dealing with not only looking but touching now. Because enjoyment between the spouses in this manner has been permitted. And so looking is permitted, like looking at the face. But they asked the Prophet ﷺ regarding their own private parts. They said, may we reveal those private parts, meaning to our spouse, or must we leave them covered? And the Prophet ﷺ said, guard your private parts except from your wife or those whom your right hands possess. There are also multiple hadith from Aisha radiallahu anha. She said that the Prophet ﷺ never saw my private part and I never saw his. And so it's considered disliked for the husband and wife, according to Ibn Qudāmah, to even look at the other's genitalia. Even to the degree that when it's time for intimacy, you aren't completely unclothed. It's a level of modesty that was maintained by the Prophet ﷺ, and therefore it's disliked, that is, not haram, disliked according to Ibn Qudāmah. We'll find some discrepancy there as well. All right, so that deals with the husband and the wife, deals with family members, deals with the broader society of, men and women interacting with each other in the various scenarios, Ibn Qudāmah's view on the ruling of the face, the hands and the feet, etc. So next thing we need to look at when it comes to the Awrah, because remember, this is in the context of what Imam al-Wasiti talked about when he was growing up in Wasit, and the circles that he attended as a young boy and the things that he witnessed between both genders and even same genders. So when it comes to same gender viewing of what can be seen, Ibn Qudāmah, he notes that a man with a man, each may look at the other besides the Awrah of the other. So it's very similar, that a man could look at another man minus the man's Awrah. Just because we're men doesn't mean we get to look at each other's Awrah. Like we don't get to look at each other in the nude. Like in our society today, men have no problem with, and sometimes it's standard practice, especially older generations, that when you go into the shower or the locker room facility, it's free willy, you know what I mean? To the degree that it even seems like a bonding moment. That if you were shy, they would think something was wrong with you. Like the older generations would think if you had a problem with being unclothed in front of other men, then there was something wrong with you. Like, we're just men, what's the problem? Just be men with we're just like talking apes right now. We're just speaking apes. But not in Islam, right? It's not permissible to look at a man's Awrah, even though they're of the same gender, even though you might not be leaning that way, if you know what I'm saying. But that type of thing, if you witness it, it can lead to sexual deviation. So we're safeguarding those types of things. It's disliked to look at a handsome young man, beardless youth. For one is not safe from fitna when looking at him. Disliked. The ruling regarding women with women is as man with man. They can look at each other, but not their Awrah. And there's a different Awrah between women. And a Muslim woman with a non-Muslim woman is as with a Muslim woman, just as a Muslim man with a non-Muslim man is as with a Muslim man, right? So he's basically saying that there's no distinction between a woman with a non-Muslim woman and a man with a non-Muslim man. The ruling applies as it would with another Muslim man for men and women for women. There is another report, however, that states that a Muslim woman should not remove her head cover in the presence of a dhimmi. A dhimmi would be a non-Muslim woman, a Christian or a Jew or whatever, nor enter the bath with her. So this is like the bathhouse. We're not talking about actually going into the tub, but like the public bath. You don't go in there with them. And that's based on the verse that we already indicated in Surah An-Nur, chapter number 31, when Allah says what means, or their women. Or their women is indicating a specificity, meaning they're women of the believers. Or they're women of the non-Muslims. You don't expose yourself to them in that way. Essentially, there's a lack of trust, is what it's insinuating, that a non-Muslim woman is not trustworthy, doesn't understand the nature and the requirements of our religion, that she might see what the woman looks like and then go describing her publicly or to somebody else in an appropriate manner. And then, concerning a woman looking at a man, right? We began with a man looking at women, looking at her face, etc. A woman looking at a man, there's two reports according to Ibn Qudāmah. The first is that it is forbidden. And there's a hadith that's mentioned in this regard. The second is that it is permissible for her to look at him as long as it's not the Awrah. And this is based on a report from Fatima bint Qais. The Prophet ﷺ said to her, complete your waiting period in the house of Ibn Maktum. He was a blind man. You may lie aside your garments to uncover, and he will not see you. Basically, she'll see him, he won't see her. And he sent her to that house, knowing that she would see him. And Aisha said, the Messenger of Allah would screen me with his cloak while I watched the Abyssinians playing in the masjid. And this is found in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim. And this, according to Ibn Qudāmah, is the sounder view, that it's permissible for a woman to look at a man so long as it's not the Awrah. The last point we'll mention from this section here is whoever is permitted to look at one from whom enjoyment is not lawful is not permitted to look with desire or for pleasure. So while he said it's permissible for you to look at the opposite gender in these circumstances and at these particular parts of the body, if you're doing it for pleasure, then you're not allowed. That's when you have to lower your gaze, as you've been commanded by Allah. Tell the believing men and the women to lower their gazes. So in the event that it's just, there's no like fitna, there's no like, oh, I'm really, this is sensual, then there's in scenarios in which it's permissible for you to look at the opposite gender. And we've highlighted those with good, I believe, good examples. Practical scenarios. But when it becomes different from than just like a normal exchange, then in that case, now you're doing with desire, you're not permitted. You're not permitted to look on, because this brings about fitna. And this ruling of the Awrah, just as it applies to life, it extends to after death. So that's where you can look at the Kitab al-Janaiz. This is the book on funeral prayers. Okay? So Imam Ibn Qudāmah says the washing of the dead is a communal obligation. It's fardu kifaya. And the person most entitled to perform the washing is one appointed by the deceased. So the person that dies, before they passed, they should have appointed somebody. And this is noted. Abu Bakr as-Siddiq radiyallahu anhu instructed his wife Asma bint Umays to wash him. And she fulfilled that request. Washing is the right belonging to the deceased. And so his appointed executor is given priority. Just as the appointed executor is given priority in distributing a third of the estate, if that was allocated. If there's no executor, meaning the deceased did not priorly, in prior note, appoint somebody, then for a male, the order of priority is the one that washes the deceased. His father, then grandfather, then son and grandson, going up or down. You could keep going, great-grandson, etc., if those were alive, great-grandfather, if that person was alive. Then the nearest male agnate relatives. Then male kin through the womb. Then unrelated men, for they are the next most entitled to pray over him. Nowhere in that list is a female on who can wash a male, except, as we've seen, the wife of the deceased. For a female, priority goes to her mother, then her grandmother, then daughter, then the nearest female relatives, and then to other women. It is permissible without disagreement for a wife to wash her husband, as we noted in the case of Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And Aisha also said, had we known then what we know now, none would have washed the messenger except his wives. This is found in Sunan Abi Dawud. As for the husband washing his wife, there are two reports. The first, the better known view, is that it's permissible. The Prophet ﷺ said to Aisha, if you were to die before me, I would wash you and shroud you. The Prophet saying that to Aisha. Ali radiallahu anhu washed Fatima and none objected. So it became a consensus, since each spouse lawfully benefits from the other in life, washing after death is likewise allowed. There's a second view which says it's not permissible for the husband to wash the wife upon death, because death separates the spouse in a way that allows a man to marry her sister or 4 others besides her. Thus, physical contact and looking revert to prohibition like in divorce. Because you're separated from the bond of marriage in life, much like if you got divorced, the rulings apply thereafter. This is the second narration. As I mentioned, he says the first is the better known view, though the second one exists, and I brought it to your attention so that you can see the severity and the seriousness by which the scholars manage these issues. The Awrah, even after death, should be concealed. No man may wash a woman other than those mentioned, nor may a woman wash a man other than her husband or her lawful master in the event that she was a bondservant, for they were forbidden to one another in life, so washing after death follows the same ruling. So if a man dies among women, or a woman among men, then he or she is to be given tayammum, not washed, according to the sounder report. This is based on a hadith. If a woman dies among men and none of them is a mahram to her, perform tayammum for her as is done for a man. You can also find it mentioned when it comes to the recommended acts of washing the deceased, like trimming the nails of the deceased, to shorten the mustache. These were sunan during life, and they continue to be sunan after a person passes. So before they pass away, you shorten the nails, you trim the mustache, etc. And then you take whatever you remove from the body and you place it with them in the shroud so that it's buried with them. It's a part of their body. It goes with them into the grave. And that's how you handle those things in life, by the way. Removing of hair, fingernails, etc. They go not into the toilet or the trash can, but they go into the ground. You take that and you bury it into the ground, much like you would if when you pass away, the body goes into the ground. That's the general understanding, and of course that's the madhab. As for removing pubic hair, which is a sunnah in life, right? Not talking about underarm hair. They said remove the underarm hair. That's another one they mentioned. To remove the hair under the arms if in the event that it's grown. As for removing the pubic hair, then there's 2 opinions. One is that it's recommended by means of some substance that removes hair, or shaving, trimming the pubic hair of a deceased person. It's one of the natural acts of the fitrah, like trimming the nails. The other is that it's not recommended because it involves touching the private area and may include looking at it. So a person could potentially remove the hair underneath a garment, right? You have something covering the awrah, because when you wash the body, it's an obligation to cover their awrah, even as the washer. And when you wash the body, you have to wrap the hand, such that when you run your hand underneath that garment, you don't feel any of the body parts. It's just surface. You can't make out what you're touching. So that when you're cleaning the body, and obviously it's a man with a man, you're not getting into any details. So here, not recommended. And this is the stronger of the 2, because it would involve not only touching, but potentially looking at, which is impermissible, he says. It is impermissible to look at, therefore it should not be done for something considered recommended. You cannot perform a recommended act at the cost of something that is haram. And so that's all we have time for tonight. But if we take a look at Ibn Qudāmah in regards to the Awrah, Ibn Qudāmah, of course, has been al-Mutawassitin. He's from the middle generation of the middle phase of the Hanabila. And as we've come to understand the various phases of the Hanabila, the first, Mutaqaddimin, then the Mutawassitin, Mutaakhirin, the first, the second, and the third latter phase is going to have further developed the madhab and its rulings based on either the explicit narrations from Imam Ahmad or the fundamentals, principles of his school. And so A few issues you'll find differ, which are now considered to be the madhab's position officially. And the first of those is, as I indicated earlier, is the face of a woman. According to the Hanabila, the face of a woman is considered part of her Awrah outside of prayer, that the face has to be covered, as well as the hands and the feet outside of the Awrah, unless there's a need. As highlighted by Ibn Qudāmah, there may be a need in which you need to see the woman's face. You might need to see, for medical reasons or otherwise, when the need arises, then it may be permissible for her to uncover her face. And of course, that's the rules of the madhab, and I just wanted to make that clear. And then pretty much everything else in general, when it comes to the Awrah, that Ibn Qudāmah had to say, remains as it is today, as it was back then. So this is step one of this particular topic. The next step that we're going to look at, so tonight, just to recap, we talked about rulings related to, after the introduction of Imam al-Ghazali, or the recap of Imam al-Ghazali's position on singing and women and young boys, etc. So in this session, we talked about definition of the Awrah, what that is, in cases of prayer, outside of prayer, and among a variety of different people, whether you're with the opposite gender that are strangers to you, whether you're the opposite gender of your family members, your Mahram, whether you're among the like gender, men between men and women between women. We discussed all of that. And then we looked at, of course, the rulings as it pertains to, washing the deceased, and how those same rulings that apply during a person's life also extend into a person's moments after they've passed until they're buried. And so that should give you some insight as to where Imam al-Wasiti was coming from when he was critiquing. And we also talked about Khalwah, being alone in private sessions with each other of the opposite gender, the impermissibility of that. And he was critiquing his society based on those things, that they were exposing their Awrah to each other during these circle sessions, their singing sessions. Sometimes they were alone with each other together in seclusion. Sometimes the women were staying at the sheikh's house and young boys at the sheikh's house, etc. And so that gets us to that point. Now, what happened after that, as we've discussed, because it continues to spiral downward into the acts, touching and various different acts of intimacy, etc. And that's where we're going to pick up next week, and we're going to talk about the prohibition of direct contact, physical contact, the ruling on illicit relations, and then we're going to talk about what constitutes zina, which is adultery or fornication, and the legal punishment that's associated with that, to better understand exactly why Imam al-Wasiti was so critical and was so harsh, using that term in a perspective here. We would say balanced, but some might say he was very harsh on his community. So, until next time, Jazakallah khair. Appreciate your attendance and your attentive listening. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen.